Well, Lenny, this is exciting. We have the opportunity to re-interview Dr. Bryan Denny because the first interview we did, boy, the audio was just not great, but he very graciously agreed to talk with us again. And so this is now the re-recording, new and improved version of an interview with Dr. Denny.
I hope everybody enjoys it because I know I did.
Right. Hi, Lenny.
Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to episode 118 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
We like to dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the front porch.
Hey, Lenny, I have a follow-up from our interview with Lois Lowry, the author of The Giver.
Okay.
So do you remember Lois talked about how as a girl she loved the American children's author Lois Lenski?
Yes.
Okay, so that rung a bell with me, and I was thinking one of our other guests also talked about Lois Lenski, and I had never heard of Lois Lenski. So I went back and remembered that it was Dr. Karen Rogenkamp from Texas A&M Commerce who also mentioned Lois Lenski. That was episode 84 of the podcast. And she was our guest to discuss the Thursday Murder Club. Karen mentioned that she's starting a digital research project focusing on Lenski's work.
I can't believe you remembered that. I'm pretty impressed.
And she specifically mentioned two of Lenski's books that influenced her. The first, Judy's Journey, and that was set during the Great Depression. And then also Prairie Girl, set in North Dakota.
Wow. That's really amazing.
Yeah, so I looked and it doesn't look like the website is up yet, but something to keep our eyes open for.
Really? So both of these authors were really inspired by this lady.
And we have never heard of her.
Well,
I mean, I did a lot of reading growing up. I know you didn't quite so much, but I had never heard of her.
Oh, is she newer?
No, she wrote more, I think, from the 20s to the 50s, maybe. So she was not a contemporary author when we were little.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe our library just didn't carry it.
Probably.
They were kind of small libraries.
Yeah, true.
I think you read everything there. So I'm going to say it wasn't there, Nance.
I read a lot of books.
You read them all. At least in the Lock Haven library you did.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, I just wanted to circle back because I thought that was so interesting.
That is very interesting. I'm very impressed with your memory. That's just amazing. Okay, well, our book this month, Shift. I love the book, and we already talked about it once, but our guest today is Dr. Bryan Denny. Bryan is a tenured associate professor in the Department of Psychology Sciences at Rice University and the director of Translational, Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Lab. He received his BA in psychology in 2005 from Stanford University and his PhD in psychology in 2012 from Columbia University. And he's been at Rice since 2016. Dr. Denny has had a longstanding interest in seeking to understand the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that underlie successful and unsuccessful emotional regulation across a spectrum of healthy and clinical populations. He is interested in utilizing the results of basic investigations into these processes in order to design and examine novel interventions focused on improving real-world emotional regulation outcomes in a variety of contexts. Outside the lab and teaching, he enjoys traveling, chocolate eclairs.
Yes.
He's got a friend of mine, sushi, playing drums, and karaoke.
That's so
I
great.
think that's quite interesting. What a well-rounded individual.
Absolutely. Well, I think he's going to be a wonderful guest to help us further delve into the research we read about in Ethan Kross's Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You.
All right, Nance, well, let's get to it.
Well, Bryan, welcome back to the front porch for our recording 2 on this book for the month of January, Shift. And the first time you were here, we had a little problem with the recording, but you were very gracious to offer to record again. So welcome back.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be back.
Well, we're excited to have you back. As we get started here talking about this book and emotional regulation, I'm interested in hearing about your research, but also what was your pathway to psychology and specifically in the area of emotional regulation?
It's a great question. It's kind of irresistible to me to think about emotions and emotion regulation, but I never thought that you could do it as a career and study emotions. I thought I wanted to be a civil engineer when I went to college. I liked math, I liked science, but I liked philosophy, I liked poetry, I liked a lot of different subjects. But like math and science courses in high school, I grew up in San Antonio, and so I thought I wanted to be a civil engineer. When I went to college at Stanford, I had no idea kind of the breadth of possibilities for things that you could study. In my defense, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, was very new at the time, which dates me and makes me older, but is what it is. Some of the very first fMRI studies were done in the early and mid 1990s, but not on emotion and emotion regulation. That wasn't the first kind of place to go. People studied vision and attention, and these processes are very relevant to emotion and emotion regulation, but it wasn't more so until around the turn of the millennium that the very first kind of brain imaging studies of emotion and emotion regulation were done. But I thought I wanted to be a civil engineer, so I was just taking different classes. And what became apparent to me was that a lot of the people doing mechanical engineering or civil engineering were really interested in tinkering with robots. That's what they said in an info session. What do you like to do on the weekends? And I know all of you have spent countless hours, tinkering with robots in your garage, and everybody nodded. And I remember thinking, I wasn't doing that. I mean, that's a cool thing to do. It's a very cool thing to do. It's not what I was doing.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about emotions and emotion regulation, for people that I knew, for other people, and thinking about how it could change. I thought that there's a hobbit, like you couldn't ever actually study that. But I knew I wanted to take intro psych. All the students told each other, students told students, and I hope that this is still true. Now I teach at Rice, and so I think it's still true. The students telling students, you have to take Psych 1. It doesn't matter what your major is going to be. You have to take Psych 1 anyway, just because it's interesting. I knew I wanted to take it. But the professor who happened to be teaching it that term, Brian Knudsen, was an affective neuroscientist. And it was so amazing to me to see psychology from an affective neuroscience perspective, and to see and understand the contemporary research that was being done into understanding the brain basis of emotion and emotion regulation absolutely wowed me, floored me. And I thought, you know what? I think I want to explore this more deeply.
And then you went on to get your PhD also. What was the turning point that you said, not only am I going to now major in psychology as an undergraduate, but I'm going to move forward and get a PhD?
Great question. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with thinking about research in emotion and emotion regulation and how fundamental it was to all of our lives, and our experiences are so bound up in not only how we experience emotion, but how we regulate emotion, because there's so many opportunities every day to do that. And as I was kind of moving forward toward grad school, the first thing I did after I graduated was to do research full-time before going to grad school. I went to Dartmouth and was a full-time research assistant there for 2 years, which is a common pathway now. A lot of the students I'm seeing are doing that. especially in cognitive neuroscience in particular, affective neuroscience kind of being nestled within the cognitive neuroscience umbrella. A lot of students are doing that, and they were doing that back in the time, at that time as well, working for medical centers or med schools and universities. Some people have internships that they can do that are still being done at NIH, for example, where you can work in the labs that exist there, in kind of a full-time post-baccalaureate context, getting full-time research experience, which was really valuable for me because, to your question, it allowed for even more time and space to kind of solidify the particular research questions that I was interested in, and really confirm that I did, in fact, want to apply to a PhD program. And so what really motivated, especially as I moved toward working with Kevin Oxner at Columbia, was in thinking about not only how we can regulate our emotions in the moment, but how we can change or get better at regulating our emotions over time. And it was really exciting to me to see how much room there was to ask more questions about how that could actually occur. Both the efficacy of kind of getting better at emotion regulation over time and the mechanisms through which that occurs behaviorally and in the brain. Because it's very interesting to think about, at least it was for me, really efficacious psychotherapies that we have now, which are wonderful in the sense that they're helping people now and continue to do so. But there seem to be open questions that could still be asked about how these psychotherapies are really having their effects. What are the mechanisms of action? Because in the case of many psychotherapies, and this can be useful in a lot of ways, but many psychotherapies are kind of amalgams or heterogeneous in the sense that many different kinds of emotion regulation strategies are trained in the course of the therapy. So that makes the therapies longer, other things equal, and more expensive, other things equal. But it also makes it a little bit more difficult to determine if somebody got better over the course of the therapy, what aspects of the therapy were particularly helpful for that person, and what strategy or strategies were kind of fit to which kind of situations that the person was experiencing that might have been helpful. That's a research question that would kind of presented itself to me in grad school that I really kind of latched onto and have continued to be very, very interested in. I think that there's tremendous space and reason to have heterogeneous psychotherapeutic interventions have absolutely a place. And I think that I was also interested in kind of probing this space at looking at shorter acting emotion regulation interventions, inspired by the work of many people, including the author of the book that you mentioned, Ethan Kross, who I partially overlapped with at Columbia. He was also co-advised by Kevin Oxner, also advised by Walter Mischel, and tremendous work on different emotion regulation strategies that you can bring to bear, including psychological distancing, which, if you're interested in, I'd be happy to talk about.
So when I think of emotion regulation after reading Ethan's book, I think of it as managing your emotions in the way that will lead to the kind of life and experience that you want. From an actual researcher's perspective, what is emotion regulation?
I don't dispute Ethan's account one bit, inspired by his research still. I agree with that. I mean, I think emotion regulation can encompass a variety of different types of strategies that you can employ. And one of the useful things, I think, for the field has been James Gross's process model, who James Gross, trained Kevin Oxner, has been very, very influential in the field. I was an undergrad at Stanford, and he is still there. Breaking down emotion regulation as a function of these processes that are inherent to it, like features of the situation that can be changed, attention, which can be deployed or redeployed, your appraisal then about what you're paying attention to in aspects of an emotional situation, and your ability to flexibly change your appraisal is quite rich and vast. There are a number of ways that appraisals can be modified. And then multifaceted emotional response, behaviorally and experientially and physiologically. So emotion regulation you can think of as attempts that can be made with conscious intention or maybe even without conscious intention that modulate one or more of those processes. The situation itself, the attention that you devote to aspects of the situation, your appraisal of the situation, or even trying to directly intervene on your emotional response itself, which if you've ever been a poker player and you're trying to keep a poker face, that's an example of trying to directly modulate your behavioral emotional response. And so emotion regulation you can think of as any of those modulations, either alone or in combination, that modify in some way or reshape your emotional experience, either your emotional experience in how you subjectively report it, behavioral representation of your emotional experience, or the physiological correlates of your emotional experience. And so it's vast in our toolbox. What our toolbox can be in shifting our emotions around is a vast toolbox, but it's not always the case that any given strategy is necessarily a great or adaptive fit for any emotional quandary that is presented. So one of the kind of exciting things I think from a clinical perspective, and I'm not myself a clinician, but I did do a postdoc in Mount Sinai Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry, thinking about clinical applications of emotion regulation. I think a really exciting thing right now is in drilling down further into those situation, strategy, contingencies as a function of person as well. So person by situation by strategy to try to explicate further which strategies may be adaptive or good fits for which people in which situations that they encounter. And maybe even training people on more of what those contingencies look like so that people can more adaptively use appropriate strategies or helpful strategies at the times that they could really help be impactful.
I really appreciate that lens of what you're doing in research and making it applicable to what is happening in a therapist's office to really impact the lives of the people that come to therapy and want to address this issue of emotional regulation and getting through tough times in life and interpreting things going on in their environment and being healthier and happier.
Yeah.
That's helpful as a clinician.
Yeah. Yeah. And like so many things with emotion and emotion regulation, it's easy to articulate the goal, but it can be harder to do it or to make it real.
Right.
When you feel negative or you feel sad, it's part of the kind of richness of our emotional life that it can't be just wished away. Some people kind of have this conception of emotions as things that we can just turn on and off, but it really doesn't work that way. And part of a lot of more acceptance or mindfulness-based approaches is less about change and more about understanding and acceptance of emotions. But sometimes you can think of that acceptance being itself a way to change your emotional experience just in accepting something that's happening. Or in a related but I think slightly different form of appraisal change in using what we're investigating now as we think of as a kind of a mindful approach of using psychological distancing, which is this strategy where you more objectively and impartially interpret what's happening. And we think it's a key component of kind of the decentering aspect of mindfulness, where you're more objectively and coolly and impartially trying to understand your stressors that are part of your emotional environment.
I had to do that many times today, Bryan. I'm just telling you.
I'll tell you.
It was a very emotional day.
Oh, you bet.
I had to use some cognitive distancing
Absolutely.
today.
Okay, I'm a layperson. When you say cognitive distancing, give me an example of what that is and in
Sure.
what situation you might use that particular tool.
Sure. So if you are in a situation where your partner maybe is very upset and they've had a really rough day and they've come home and you're having a discussion with them and they're starting to spiral and get very, very upset. Emotions sometimes can build on each other, and the intensity just seems to be getting greater and greater from the other person. And in using a more psychologically distant mindset, which can be a misleading term, I think, it's not about diminishing an empathic connection with the other person. And there's actually evidence to suggest that empathy isn't inherently harmed by the way in which I'm meaning psychological distancing in this way. It's more so that rather than becoming swept up in the swell of the emotion, you rhetorically or mentally take a step back to more fully understand what is involved in the situation. So, you've had a hard day, you're feeling very upset, you're hyperventilating, you're describing what's happening. You're here in the here and now. You're not extrapolating about what's going to happen tomorrow or an hour from now. You're not dwelling on what happened yesterday or a week ago. You're right there in the moment thinking about what's happening. And so you can kind of describe that to the other person. That may diminish in the other person their kind of overwhelm. You can apply emotion regulation for yourself, but you can also, in an intrinsic sense, but you can also apply emotion regulation for someone else in an extrinsic sense, where you're kind of creating the strategies, but describing it to somebody else in a way to try to influence their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
You can do it within yourself as well. I mean, if you're the person that had the really bad day and you've come home and you're feeling that swell of emotions, that you can kind of think, okay, I'm here, I had a bad day, but now I'm at home, I'm present, I'm turning on the light, I'm sitting down in the chair, I'm here. This is what the situation is. If you just got in an accident with your car, there's a big damage to the side. The car has a dent in it. The dent is in the door. Then you're kind of describing what the situation is rather than an intractable ball. You're focusing on this is what it is. It is what it is. People say that sometimes, but elaborating, this is what the situation is, and I'm not thinking about how it's definitely going to be better tomorrow. Maybe it will, maybe it won't be. That's not what I'm focused on. There are other kind of stressful situations we think of in my lab as well, even things that are harder to change or they're very difficult to change. Thoughts about someone that you're grieving and that you've lost. It's not about diminishing any empathic connection to that person, but just when you may be overwhelmed because of grief, there are other negative circumstances that you can encounter that the grief can then make it more challenging to be able to deal with those, to be able to process stressors more adaptively, to be able to diminish the kind of perceived stress that the environment can give you, that this distancing element we found can be helpful. One other thing I'll mention just as an example is we're looking right now in an NIH grant that we're working on the overwhelm felt by family caregivers of persons with dementia and the stress that situation can sometimes, not in all cases, but for many people can introduce significant amounts of stress. And we're investigating the potential utility of targeted usage of psychological distancing to diminish this overwhelm or to be present with just objective and impartial thoughts about stressors, not to do so all the time, but to do so maybe especially at times that things feel particularly overwhelming and that it may be difficult in diminishing that overwhelm and that stress. We think of it like wanting to train people to have tools in their bag. Not that that would be the only tool that you would have in your bag, and not that it would be the only one that you would use all of the time, but just that you would have it there and that you would kind of hone it so that you can bring it out and use it when it might be helpful to you.
Well, that requires so much self-knowledge and observation. So it really is a skill that an individual has to work on, just like any skill, like learning how to play tennis, how to do anything. It seems to me that it takes a lot of skill. It seems to me that there's definitely a role for a therapist there when you're not able to figure out what are the interventions that will work for you. Do you feel like you wish every student had an opportunity to take a class on emotion regulation so that they would be better equipped as they move to adulthood?
In my lab, we think everybody could use a little more emotion regulation.
Yeah.
How about getting the dissertation done? I bet they needed a little bit of emotional regulation as well.
For sure.
Absolutely. But yes, I think that in many cases, having a clinician there with you and a therapist there with you can absolutely be helpful, because learning more about those contingencies, learning more, as you said, about yourself, personality characteristics that you may have, and matching strategies adaptively to your affective style, but in predictable ways, importantly. I had a wonderful student in one of my emotion regulation seminars here at Rice that asked a question that I'll never forget that I thought was so great. If person factors can vary, and if situation factors can vary, and if the strategy factors also can vary, if everything can vary, then what's testable, right?
Yeah.
I thought it's a great question, and this is the answer. Elaborated models that have a lot of factors that can vary, but testing those models by holding some of those factors constant and varying others. But what's great about the question is it illustrates that to really test this more fully, you have to build more elaborated models and then test certain aspects of them at certain times. You can't, in a given experimental study, you can't vary every factor factorially, because it would lead to too many, particularly in an experimental context. So you have to make an argument for varying some factors and holding others constant. I think the field is increasingly doing that. So basically, the great question, I think the answer is we have to have more sophisticated models of how emotion and emotion regulation work, which I think we're increasingly developing. I think Dr. Kross is fantastic among many others in pushing some of those models forward in ways that are testable. So if they're testable, what's the payoff of that? Ultimately being able to make predictions for people about what strategies might be helpful in which situations, and maybe giving them training, maybe nudges or some reminders, some feedback about helping them to shape those adaptive contingencies of person, situation, and strategy. And some of those cases, I think, could be very well suited to doing that process with a clinician. I think will always be the case, with varying levels, I think, of how intensive, like how much contact. For some people, could you have learning more about some of those contingencies just through a smartphone? I think that maybe you could. I don't think in all cases. I think that there's going to be different levels or different types or modalities of intervention that may be more or less fit in different cases or for different people. But we're testing more of those now. Not just do they work, but also how do they work? What in their brain, what in their body is changing responsivity? What are the brain functional connectivity patterns that are changing? And I'll just say about that, you could think, well, that's a really kind of academic question to know what in the brain is doing it, but it can be a very actionable and clinically relevant question as well, because we could think of drugs that target particular patterns of functional connectivity in the brain, or even direct neurostimulation for particular areas of the brain, which is increasingly being examined. And psychotherapies operate on the brain as well. So we think about what are maybe the mechanistic targets that different types of emotion regulation could intervene upon. And to answer this question, we and many others are thinking not just does emotion regulation work, but how?
Wow.
Okay.
Is there anything that you would like to talk about that we haven't covered?
I think it's great that you all are thinking about this in the context of this work that's being done all around the world. I think that people are being helped now by psychotherapies. And I think that as our conception of all of psychopathology evolves, as we understand more about the underlying mechanisms, I think that the future is bright for hopefully learning more and more about what really the fundamental mechanisms underlying psychopathology are, and then how we can intervene upon them with novel interventions in a variety of ways for different people and in different situations to help them cope more adaptively with stressful experiences.
And ultimately make the world a better place, right?
Hope so.
That's the dream.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
That would be good. Well, thank you so much, Bryan, for joining us on the front porch. I have to tell you, my neuroscience right now, it's firing on so many different levels. You have stimulated. So I am listening to you and I'm getting fires all over my head. This is triggering this. And I'm thinking of so many different things and applications for what you're saying. I have enjoyed this so much. And I just thank you so much for your time and your willingness to help us re-record this.
Of course. Well, thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Linda. I really appreciate it. And yeah, feel free to keep in touch.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, Nance.
That was so great.
It was so great. And I loved everything he had to say. And it just makes me jealous now because when I was going through grad school, this neuroscience stuff, it wasn't quite at the level that it is now. I mean, this stuff has really taken off.
Yeah.
And I was getting a little bit of it as I was coming up through. And now it's this whole dynamic field and more is being done and people are understanding and there's less blame involved and people are understanding why they act the way they do. And the field is exciting. And I loved his excitement for what all of these studies are telling us and showing us.
Yeah.
Although it's brain work and neuroscience, that might be scary from looking at it, maybe from the outside. It's very understandable when that's my brain. That's how I think. That's how I act. That's my existence. This is showing you that this is my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And people will understand that and they get that.
Yeah, I just think of brand new interventions that are going to be available to clinicians like you as this research evolves and matures. And the difference that's going to make, it just seems like it is going to revolutionize what we think of in terms of mental health, whether dealing with chronic issues or dealing with episodic, non-acute kind of issues of mental health. It is fascinating.
It's so exciting. And this is near the end of my career, but it's so neat to have that torch. Like it is a career like any, I guess, career. It builds upon the people that have done the work in the past and people just keep building on it. And there's more and more studies and more advancements. And I've always thought, wow, we could be doing more of those brain imaging with autism and helping to understand that and some of these other things. So it's a fascinating discussion with him. I wish we had more time. I could have gone on hours with this guy.
Yeah, he mentioned James Gross and Gross's process model. When we knew you were going to talk with Bryan, I was just doing some research just to prepare myself a little bit and read a journal article by James Gross. And it was an overview of emotion regulation research. And I was really surprised to read that really it was in the 1990s that that research on emotion regulation really took off. But then you pair it with the technological research and innovations that are now happening in the 21st century. And you think, wow, we are in a whole new world of really understanding how to do a better job around emotion regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that area in and of itself is, to me, just scrumptious, Nance. I love all of it. I do. I love it all. I can't even verbalize it. It's still exploding. I mean, I think we had a big explosion of understanding this. Now it's kind of picking up the pieces and where to go with it, how to develop it more. We're certainly not done as a field, but there's just such more opportunity here to really help people. And so I'm really encouraged. I like talking to these researchers that are at the university level, seeing what's going on with them, because, you know, some of that hasn't trickled down to us yet. Some of it has. Absolutely has trickled down, and as a part of textbooks and training now and seminars and CEUs and all that good stuff. So I appreciate very much what they're doing.
Yeah. And he seemed very aware of and centered on the idea, not just of the research, but how will the research be applied? How is this going to make a difference in people's lives? How will this change how clinicians work with patients? How will this help patients? Which I love to see in a researcher.
I do too. That he's in it, I think, for absolutely the right reasons. Yeah. He wants to help people. And that's the magic and the beauty of the field. All right. We'll stop by the front porch next time and we will review Dust Child, written by Wen Fan Kwai Mai. So we will be talking about these two sisters.
Yes, I cannot wait to talk with you about Dust Child. Everyone, thanks so much for listening. Our website is frontporchbookclub.com, and I will put links to some of the resources that Bryan Denny mentioned in our interview in case anyone wants to read more about this, and James Gross and fMRIs, all that good stuff.
That's all good. Our episodes come out twice a month on the first and third Wednesday of every month. Nancy, I will see you next time.
See you next time, scrumptious Denny.
Bye-bye.
Bye.